Glad. Okay, welcome. This is the Senate Committee on Institutions. It is January 13th. And we have two items on the agenda today. First, we're going to go over Act 33 of last year. And as the committee knows, that is the capital bill. It's a 2-year capital bill. But we went over the financial part of the bill on Friday, and today we're going to focus on policy. And then at 2 p.m., we have a joint Information Technology Oversight Committee meeting, which will be held in room 32, which is the room of our House partner in this part of our jurisdiction. And so that'll be at 2. So those of you who want to watch both, you'll need to switch on to a different YouTube account at that point. So let us, actually we have a new person. So let's all introduce ourselves. I'm Wendy Harrison. I represent the Windham District and I'm chair of this committee.
And Rob Plunkett, represent Bennington District and vice chair.
Joe Major, Windsor.
Russ Ingles, Essex Orleans.
John Benson, Orange District.
Welcome. Okay, so John Gray, Ledge Council will be presenting the policy overview of Act 33.
Sounds good. Hello.
Thank you very much for being here.
Sounds good. I'm happy to be here. Afternoon, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. So what I'm going to do is I will screen share Act 33, the capital bill, which, as the chair stated, is a biennial bill. It's covering 2 years. I'm going to do, maybe a little bit more overview than I would typically do, given that we have a new member. So I think it might be helpful just to get some structure for that. I'm sure that Scott previously went over this, but we're dealing with a 2-year budgeting process. And something that I wanted to flag is the difference in drafting that you're going to see in the bill this year. It's going to look like what you see in Act 33, but unlike last year where we were assembling essentially from scratch, or given the capital budget presentation that you received from the administration, right? Those sections could have moved around. Now you have the given framework of what the bill is. And essentially this act that you would be doing this year to update the capital budgeting process is a capital budget adjustment act. So it will have the form of this act that you see, Act 33, but it's going to involve a lot of striking language and replacing and updating based on the capital budgeting that you'll receive, I think, next week. So just as an example of what that would look like, many of you will already be familiar with this, but this is a prior second session year capital bill. This is your capital budget adjustment act for 2024. And just wanted to show it's in the form of the year prior, but as you see, you're striking through many of the numbers as you have updated figures. In some cases, like what you'll see here, obviously a particular project, the appropriation was no longer necessary, so it was updated to reflect that fact. So just wanted to give you a sense of how the drafting is going to be different this year. We have the structure, and now you are amending the existing Act 33. A high-level overview of the pre-policy sections before I jump into the policy. I know that you received some of this last week, but just super high level. Your first section of the capital bill sets out the intent for both years of the biennium. And it tells you what can be done in the first year and what will remain in the second year. Your sections 2 through 16 set out the appropriations that are backed by bonding for each of the programs. So a lot of that is your section 2. You're dealing with state buildings, BGS, and as you recall from last year, you have different programs in which you're authorizing spending backed by bonding for particular projects. And then there's some ability within those sections, there's authority for BGS and the like to move some of those funds around within particular provisions. So section 1 and 10, sections 2 through 16 are appropriations. Section 17 is what we call reallocations. I'm actually going to stop sharing just because I'll flip it back on in a second, but just because I'm doing the high level overview. Section 17 is your reallocations. So as you know, when you authorize spending in particular sections, there is a clawback that eventually happens if a certain period of time passes. So for general geo bonding, which is most of what the capital bill is like, your authorizations, you may reallocate after it's a 3-year period, and then you shall reallocate after a 5-year period. For the cash fund, you may recall, and I'll talk about this when we get to the policy sections, there's a different clawback period for cash. And that was extended last year to be 3 years. So your section 17 sets out what's happening with old unexpended funds. What are you going to do with that money? And if you tallied up all of the funds that you see in the capital bill, you would see that the bonding authorization is lower than the total amount of spending authorization set up in the act. So where is that extra money accounted for? You have reallocations, and you may have cash fund pieces as well. But your reallocations pull back money for prior authorizations and appropriate them for particular purposes. Section 18 actually sets out your bonding authorization. So up to that point in the act, you've just had intent, and then you have the sets of appropriations, but no backing for the appropriations. Section 18 actually conducts, it actually authorizes that general obligation bonds for the total amount that you have. And then finally, section 19 of the act talks about your cash spending authorization. So up to that point in the bill, we've been talking about appropriations backed by bonding. And then section 19 sets out specific authorizations that rely on the cash fund as against your bonding authorizations. With that, I will jump to the policy question, but let me know if you've had any questions on just kind of high level how the bill works.
I just have a comment. I was surprised that the bonding authorization in section 18 wasn't relatively, it doesn't happen necessarily in the next year or so. It can happen multiple years after this is approved. Because I'm used to municipal where when you say you're gonna go bond, you go bond. Here it's just in the state, it's more complicated because
authorizations for.
Yeah, so it could happen in 3 or 4 years or 5 years. So just a fun fact.
And if you look at that figure that you see in section 18, what you'll see is the point I was noting earlier, is lower than the total spending authorizations that you would see in section 1, because there's additional funding we put it in there, covered last week, cash fund reallocations and the like that fill in that gap between the intent, the total appropriations, and the actual bond. So okay. So section 20 is when the bill changes course. The first 19 sections deal with your spending authorizations. They deal with money, they deal with bonding, cash fund, and the like. And then the back end of the capital bill is a set of policy decisions. So theoretically, you could have a capital bill that does not have this back end, right? You're always going to have a capital budgeting process, but the policy are sets of decisions each year that happen to shape the course of something within the capital process. So section 20 is the start of your policy sections. You're switching gear from money. And we start with section 20. This is an amendment to the section 701A, which is your capital construction bill. And basically, this is trying to align, you're going to see at the bottom of the page, this section amended the date at which the report on unexpended funds. So this is not the full capital budget report, but basically the solicitation goes out to see for each agency, where do your projects stand? How much money have you spent on these? How much money do you have left standing out there? Are you going to be spending this? What are your project phases? So this is a way of checking in on projects and seeing what money remains. And the amendment that you have is not touching anything substantively about the kind of report that has to be done. It's just changing the date at which that happens. As you can see, it moves it to the third Tuesday of every annual session. The reason for this is that is the date, that's next week for us, I believe, that is the date on which you receive all of your, it's the big budget, it's when you receive the capital budget. And so this is aligning that receipt of that report to that date. So not a substantive amendment to anything about the content of those unexpended fund reports, but just aligning the dates.
And that makes sense because they won't know it. It would be very difficult to know it December 15th.
Section 21 is, I would call this a presentation update to the form of the capital budget that you receive. So 32 VSA section 310 sets out the whole big, these are the sets of information that are required within the capital budget that you receive. One of the identified problems or potential areas for improvement that was talked about last year, and what you'll see here, was that years and years ago, when BGS for folks came in, they often included a chart with their capital budget requests that would show kind of the duration of funding over time, the stages of particular projects pursued, and then relevant more now, because the cash fund is a relatively recent structure, where the actual sources of those funds are. Is it bonding? Is it cash? And you may have incentives to ensure that cash is spent quite quickly, right? So this is an update to the presentation of that capital budget request. And what you see is amounts appropriated and expended for the current fiscal year and for the preceding fiscal year shall be indicated for capital programs and individual projects. And then the new language, this is the new addition, the policy update here, is that for the 5 fiscal years preceding those, the assessment would include aggregate amounts appropriated and expended for individual projects. So the total, and then also the year. So which amounts shall be categorized by funding type and presented in a format that concisely displays the funding streams and project phases for each individual project over time. So it's meant to give you guys additional information about where things stand with a given project in a readily understandable format. This was the language we came up to try to capture chart. If we just said chart, that doesn't say too much. So this is trying to produce that kind of information that you would naturally have received in a chart. And that's why I use the reference to format that concisely displays, because it doesn't have to be in any particular given form, but as long as it is getting that information to you in a concise manner, that's the goal here. So again, just touching on the capital budget that you're going to receive and trying to ease the decision-making process, trying to accelerate things when they get to you.
And I just want to comment on this one too, because appropriated and expended, you might think that, again, expended would happen right after appropriated, but sometimes there's a pretty long lag. Like with the women's prison, for example, we didn't have appropriations, I think, for 2 years. So it looked like we weren't doing something. If you looked only at those 2 years, but this having it be a 5-year period, it'll be more evident. It would take, in this case, a 10-year period to actually show expenditures and revenues for the same project.
And that's a nice way to foreground also what you can reasonably expect the process of building out this Capital Budget Adjustment Act will be like. Unlike other bills that may circulate through the committee and have a relatively short cycle depending on the process, this is going to take months to do this. And so you're going to just have different agencies, particularly BGS, coming in and updating on where projects stand. And this kind of informational presentation is to help facilitate that kind of presentation so that you can assemble over the course of the session this full, accurate, capturing every demand for the capital budget across the session. So section 22, we're switching gears a little bit. We've been talking about the capital budget that you receive in the form of presentation. Here we're talking about the actual cash fund that's established. Again, that's a relatively recent structure within the last 5 years that was established and can be used for similar purposes to the kinds of projects that are pursued in the capital itself and typically backed by bonding. But this would provide cash within Act 33. If you're looking for the section that has your spending authorizations for cash, that's section 19. So just know that has a different revenue stream backing it, basically as cash backing it rather than bonding. But this is an amendment to the creation of the cash fund and the clawback mechanism that exists for the cash fund. So prior to this amendment, any entity authorized to make expenditures from the capital infrastructure subaccount shall have not more than 2 years from the legislative session in which the act authorizing the expenditure was enacted to encumber the funds. the remaining unencumbered funds would remain part of that fund account. The basic issue that folks found themselves with last session was that you're hitting that 2-year count. And this is a way of bumping it out another year, basically to give some time to come back and see what's happening with those expenditures from the cash fund. So we call it punting. You don't necessarily have to call it punting, but it extended that clawback by a year, because I think last year would have been the first year that you were actually confronting the clawback mechanism from the cash fund. Now that will be this year, I believe. So the next piece, section 22A, is a directives to JFO to report on the cash fund, just giving some background. I have not seen this report, but it may be out there, and that report would provide historical context for the creation of the cash fund, compare the financial management practices for bonds against cash, distinguish between the intended uses of the sub-accounts. As you'll recall, the cash fund has 2 sub-accounts. One is one you can think of as almost directly mirroring typical capital bill appropriations, and then you have another sub-account called the other infrastructure, essential investments and reserve sub-account, into which spending authorization, if that happens in the Appropriations Act, may pool funds. So this report would also talk about what are the intended uses of those different sub-accounts, would describe for each year since its inception the source of funds and the annual expenditures from those sub-accounts, and outline the current legislative process by which appropriations are made from the cash fund. Just a little reminder here, there's some oddity in the ways that we both talk about and pursue the spending authorizations that happen from the cash fund. Unlike the general capital bill structure that you see in sections 1 through 18, which set out the spending authorizations that are backed by bonding and actually make outright the appropriations for those particular pieces, the way that the legislature has kind of over the years since the cash fund was created set up this process is this committee indicates its intent for capital bill like projects to be appropriated out of the cash fund, and then kind of sends that message to the appropriations committee to conduct the actual outright appropriations themselves. So it's almost like a double spending authorization that happens, but that's kind of a negotiated process that has happened since the cash fund's inception. And so this report would speak to that piece as well. And it will make more sense when we're going through it. But it can be, it's different than the bonding process where the capital bill is outright making those appropriations happening. This is requiring some additional effort from the appropriations committee to back up the committee's decisions in this space.
Just a question for you. So is that approval of the appropriations committee, is that set? Is that just, that's just our practice? That has been our practice.
Yep. That's something
We'll talk about.
I tried to stress last year, and I don't know that it was always received. A lot of traditions happen in this space, is what I would say.
Right.
Technically, under law, the committee could say, we're authorizing these. That's what we're doing. But I think politically, you face consequences from the natural holders of cash appropriations, right? So that's, I say it's negotiated. It's also a fact of kind of politically the sensitivities that folks have.
Right. But we'll talk about it this year.
Yep.
I suspect that the administration may have suggestions on it.
Sure. But you are correct that there is nothing in the statute that says you've got to use this particular committee for this. Beyond the staff of subject matter areas for the committee itself, right? So section 23, something you'll also see in the policy sections is individual decisions made with respect to particular properties, and that's what you see here. Section 23 is transferring the Randall Meadow property from the town of Waterbury, and there's a set of conditions that have to be met for the commissioner to make that transfer. And something, we don't have to go into detail about the actual property itself, but just something to note. This may be transferred, if I'm recalling correctly. We have statutory procedures to ensure that transfers of property are subject to particular procedures and that you receive certain amounts, right? That there's a public bid or things of this kind. The notwithstanding that happens here is to allow an outright transfer. So it's notwithstanding some of the procedures and would move that, presuming conditions are met, the Randall Meadow property, whichever, if I remember correctly, was subject to flooding, and there's once stormwater management needs have been addressed, permits have been obtained, and created a plan to align that transfer with the lease that can be. Section 24 is an update to a notice provision for the Capital Complex Flood Recovery Special Committee. So this is a committee that provides updates on the Capital Complex recovery, and the update that you see here is pretty small. Prior to this amendment, BGS would have to provide quarterly updates to the special committee on the planning process for flood recovery. And additionally, now BGS would be required to provide timely, not quarterly, but timely notification to Montpelier and the Montpelier Commission for Recovery and Resilience of any alterations to proposals and plans for that flood recovery. So an additional notice provision, it's not with the same regularity, but if there are alterations to plans proposals, City of Montpelier and that commission would receive updates from BGS.
What, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
The word timely is very vague. Is that no?
Yeah, it was, so what I recall is that there had been some thinking about whether you just mirror a similar regularity, so having something like quarterly updates. But the thinking was that the city and the commission don't just have to have an update as of a particular date. They only needed it as of things that might have a meaningful impact. And so I would connect the timely with the alterations to proposals and plans. So it's not timely notice full stop, right? It's if there have been alterations to proposals and plans, ensure that you reach out to the city and the commission to update them as to that fact. But you're correct that timely doesn't say within 3 months, you could say within 2 months of alter, right? It's just a general phrase that would disregard this.
Did you get your question answered? Because I just have a follow-up, which is the intent to notify them prior to the whatever is happening, or it doesn't even say that, so it could be after
I mean,
something that's happened.
I take it to be that the commission will have altered the proposal or plan. So that's the action that the
Okay.
commission has taken, and that's what triggers the update. So it's post alteration to the proposals and plans is the way that I understand it. Of course, this is just what is statutorily required. If the commissioner would like to update the city, they're not prohibited from doing so, right? So if they wanted to give advance notice, there's nothing stopping them, but this is just ensuring that they do in fact let them know on a timely basis of any alterations to those plans. And I mean, the other way to think, I know that you're both getting at how much can you rely on this fact? I mean, and I would just point out that this amendment only increases notice provisions, right? So this is boosting the amount of notice that goes out. This is not putting anyone in a worse position from a notice perspective. Section 25 is a repeal to a provision in a former capital bill. This was a report on the potential reuse of the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility site. It was justice involved women were being moved out, and there's consideration whether to make this available for justice involved men. There is a report that was intended to be due December 15th of this past year, but this section repealed that. So this is essentially backing away from that particular plan. And I'm happy to jump over to that act if helpful, but that's really what it's doing, is just saying we don't need this feasibility study anymore for this reuse of the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility site. Section 26, you can think of as a way of ensuring that funds remain within the capital budgeting process. It's a way of kind of keeping it within the committees of jurisdiction. Coming back to you guys is maybe the simple way to think about this. And it says that if the Commissioner of Finance and Management offsets any capital funds, 2023 capital bill for this particular section, the emergency generator and boiler plant replacement, if those are offset with federal funds, there might have been federal funds coming in at that time, then any offset amounts shall be reused for future capital construction projects as part of the capital budget process. So instead of just allowing that money to flow outside the capital budgeting process, this is saying, no, those are really capital budget appropriations. We want that to remain part of the process. The fact that we got federal funds is just a good thing for the state, but we want to keep it for this process. So this is ensuring that this particular project and the appropriations behind it stay within these committees.
Just a clarification on that, as I understood what you said earlier, if in fact the funds weren't used, and so in 5 years, it would automatically come back in anyway, so why the need for a special carve out here, I guess?
So two separate things. You're right to identify the clawback mechanisms that exist in statute. It's important to say that, you know, sometimes we don't get the full extent of the sentences, I guess the way we say, oh, the money's clawed back, but I'm not specifying that instance to what it is clawed back. So it's important to say the clawback that happens in those sections is part of the capital budget process, right? But money could go elsewhere. Money could go elsewhere. So it's important just to say the clawback is keeping it within the capital budgeting process. This separate section is unrelated to that, would not be picked up by those triggers because it's 2023, so the years wouldn't be, it's still timely at this point. But additionally, the real thing that this is getting at is federal funds. That's what's happening in this case. When we're talking about the clawback mechanisms earlier, we've had our standard, you're getting state dollars for projects and an agency simply hasn't spent them on a particular project. So kind of a check-in on unexpended funds and saying, maybe this isn't being put to its best uses. And it could come back and we could reallocate those funds to other kinds of projects. What this is saying is, happily, the state received some federal funds. And as a result, the agency or whoever might be owning that project didn't require all of the bonding authorization that happened in the Capital Bill Act because they received these extra funds. So to the extent that the Commissioner of Finance determines there's been that offset, we received enough federal funds and essentially supplanted the money that was authorized in the Capital Bill Act. Let's make those stay part of the capital budgeting process. So it's addressing kind of two separate issues.
Thank you.
Section 27 is an expansion to a prior year authorization to the Sergeant at Arms for an update and upgrade here at the State House. So there was appropriated in FY25 $100,000 for the replacement of State House cafeteria furnishings. What you may recall from last year is that didn't need that much money to pursue that particular project. And so there was a desire to build in additional security measures for the State House and basically the same authorization. So not increasing the dollar amount, but expanding the scope of the projects permissible under the authorization said you can purchase and install at the State House an X-ray machine inside the screen baggage.
Which has happened.
And then lastly, takes effect on passage. So that's the extent of the policy sections. Happy to talk about any particular pieces you may be interested in. I think, you know, it's the sort of bill that comes together a bit more slowly than other bills you may see coming through, and it's really dependent on factual updates from those pursuing the projects. And I don't know what is going to come this year, so we will find out.
It will always be interesting. Well, no, I think that was a great presentation. It's helpful for me to rehash. Good question. You asked good questions. Anything else? Scott, do you have anything that you wanted to add to this?
Just Senator Benson, I just don't believe I sent the cash report to you because you hadn't been appointed when I sent it out to the rest of the committee, but it is on the reports website and I'm happy to show it for you. For the record, Scott Moore, Joint Fiscal Office, kind of forgot that part.
Thank you.
But yes, if you're interested, I can send you the report itself. Senator Plunkett has pulled up already, so you can pull it right up from the website.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Teacher's pet.
I thought I was the only one that noticed that.
Next week it'll be you. Okay.
And just super basic thing you likely already know, but just, you know, people throw out different terms, calendar year, fiscal year, and the like, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Your fiscal year is starting July 1, and then it's ending in the year in which you see the number. So FY26, that's the year that we're currently in. It started past July 1, ends this June 30. So just keeping track of your fiscal years and the different ways in which people reference years can be Maybe more problematic for me because in the education space, there's so many different calendars, but here I think it's a bit more intuitive. So,
Yeah, no, thank you. It's important because we assume and that needs to be clear. Okay, I think we're good. Anybody have any more questions or comments? All right, then we are adjourned.
thank you guys.
No, thank you. This was perfect.
Perfect.